This channel is part of the History Hit network.
On the 10th of May 1940, German forces poured into the Low Countries and France. The phony war, which had seen only minor air and sea clashes in Western Europe since the invasion of Poland on the 1st of September 1939, had been transformed into devastating reality. Within a month, the British had retired across the Channel from Dunkirk, and shortly afterwards, France surrendered. Britain, however, was determined to fight on alone. But it was clear that for the time being, the only way of hitting back at Germany was from the air. The bomber offensive was about to begin.
In the bomber war, it changed from night to night, really. The tactics changed from night to night, and always something new going on. And if you go from one year to the next, you find a chap who operated in 1942. He had a completely different story for me, in a way. But it was a fluid war the whole time. They think of something and we thought of something, that sort of thing.
For almost 5 years, from May 1940 until April 1945, Bomber Command of the Royal Air Force, joined in 1943 by bombers of the 8th and 15th United States Army Air Forces, attacked cities, factories, and communication networks in Germany. The rationale for this onslaught went back 30 years to the Great War of 1914 to 1918, when military air power first showed that armed conflict would no longer be confined to land and sea. Soon, military theorists and enthusiasts began to dream of bombing as the decisive element in future wars. Victory, they said, would be achieved by strategic bombing. Extreme advocates of the policy even argued that air power alone could win a war by means of a preemptive strike, without armies or navies being involved. This was the so-called knockout blow.
Now, in the early part of the First World War, aircraft only had the ability to bomb the battlefield, and that was known therefore as tactical bombing. Gradually, as they got heavier bomb loads and longer ranges, they were able to go beyond the battlefield, and that was called strategic bombing. That evolved into a twin policy of, first of all, hitting industrial targets, and secondly, undermining the morale of the civilian population. They were aiming to undermine the capacity of an enemy to fight a war and his civilian population to support it.
In Britain, strategic bombing became central to a critical debate. On the 1st of April 1918, the independent RAF had been formed from the Royal Flying Corps and Royal Naval Air Service, and the ability of bombers to make an entirely separate contribution to warfare became the cornerstone of RAF doctrine. The chief of the air staff, Sir Hugh Trenchard, argued that the moral effect of bombing outweighed the physical effects by 20 to 1. And there can be no doubt that we must be prepared for long-distance aerial operations against an enemy's main base of supply. He persuaded influential politicians that he was right, and the independent RAF, which some had wanted disbanded, survived. Trenchard also convinced ministers that bombers were able to keep order in rebellious areas like Iraq and the northwest frontier of India at less cost than the army. The tactic of imperial policing, as this became known, further enhanced the reputation of the RAF bombers and persuaded theorists and staff officers that they really could achieve decisive results. In 1923, the RAF held that to defend the United Kingdom, 2/3 of its aircraft should be bombers able to harass an enemy's homeland. Given all this, the statement made in 1932 by Cabinet Minister Stanley Baldwin that claimed that the bomber will always get through hardly seemed fantastic. No defense against the modern aircraft with its longer range, large bomb carrying capacity, defensive gunners, greater accuracy of navigation, and improved bombing technique seemed possible. This also applied, of course, to Britain, and there were those that saw the dangers ahead.
History Hit is a streaming platform that is just for history fans, with fantastic documentaries covering fascinating figures and moments in history from all over the world. From the Battle of Trafalgar and the Revolutionary era, right through to the Second World War. If you are looking for your next military history fix, then this is the service for you. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you cannot find anywhere else. Sign up now for a free trial, and War Stories fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code WARSTORIES at checkout.
Winston Churchill warned of the most frightful scenes of ruin and slaughter in Britain as a result of massive air raids on the outbreak of war. By 1937, war with Hitler's Germany was becoming increasingly likely. While the diplomatic wrangling continued, the RAF prepared for the worst by drawing up the Western air plans. These were based not only on the assumption that the bomber would always get through, but that it would accurately locate and attack its designated target. A further presumption was that this could be achieved in daylight by bombers flying in formation to provide mutual protection with their massed guns against fighter aircraft.
In 1937, the Air Staff drew up a series of plans to attack 15 groups of targets, which are known together as the Western Air Plans. One of those, Western Air Plans 5, aimed to attack the Ruhr, and in particular, they were going to hit 19 power plants and 26 coking plants, with the idea of paralysing the Ruhr industry, the war industry which the Germans would be relying on. To do this, it was planned that they would launch 3,000 sorties in a fortnight and calculate they would lose just 176 bombers, but it will paralyse the Germans.
Across the Atlantic, the United States had also reached similar conclusions. President Roosevelt was increasingly concerned about Germany's expansion into Austria and Czechoslovakia, and foresaw that American involvement in Europe would be needed in order to check Hitler's territorial advances. Roosevelt was also acutely aware of the strength of the German Luftwaffe. In January 1939, he warned Congress that our existing air forces are so utterly inadequate that they must be strengthened, persuading it that 5,500 combat aircraft should be made available by June 1941. When the Germans invaded Poland 9 months later, the British Air Corps' defensive role was extended to include the whole Western Hemisphere. For this, long-range aircraft would undoubtedly be necessary. A Martin B-10 had flown non-stop from Alaska to Seattle in 1934, and despite lukewarm official support, its success prompted Boeing to develop a 4-engined prototype military aircraft based upon a civilian transport machine. This was called the Y-1 B-17, and the Flying Fortress had been born. The Consolidated Aircraft Company's B-24 Liberator soon followed the B-17 into the air, and it was these famous aircraft that would later see action over Germany.
Both these bombers were heavily defended with machine guns. They also made use of a liquid oxygen system which had been developed and the Norden bomb sight, which would enable them to bomb from high level. Because of the vast number of machine guns that it had, in comparison with other aircraft, the B-17 was known as the Flying Fortress, and the idea that the B-17 and the B-24 would be self-defending bombers was born.
Although the RAF flew a few Flying Fortresses operationally, no US bomber unit operated in Europe for almost another 3 years. Meanwhile, the RAF had put the theory of daylight bombing into practice.
In 1939, the RAF had 4 twin-engine aircraft: the Blenheim, the Hampden, the Wellington, and the Whitley. The Blenheim only carried 1,000 pound of bombs, but the Whitley carried 7,000 pound of bombs. The drawback was that they weren't heavily defended with machine guns, and they only flew at roughly 250 miles an hour, which made them vulnerable to the German fighters. So any idea that they could act as self-defending bombers was quickly destroyed in the early months of the war.
The British soon learned that their bombers were easy prey for the 350-mile-an-hour Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighter plane, and the concept of daylight precision bombing, even in tight defensive formation, was distinctly flawed. Losses were simply unsustainable. On the 4th of September, for example, 5 Blenheims went down, and on the 18th of December 1939, 12 out of 22 Wellingtons failed to return from attacks on enemy shipping. Another painful lesson was learned in May 1940, when formations of Battles and Blenheims suffered grievous losses, and in some cases, total annihilation over France. There was little hope of improvement. Whitley bombers ranged freely at night over Germany, dropping leaflets in the phony war, which encouraged the RAF to lower in a surprising degree our opinion of the opposition we expected to meet. Shaken by the scale of the carnage among the day bombers, the British opted for night bombing once the air campaign began in earnest. On the 15th of May 1940, 99 bombers attacked oil and transport targets in the Ruhr to signal the beginning of the strategic bombing offensive on Germany. Night bombing proved less costly in aircraft and men, but it was worryingly inaccurate. Photographic reconnaissance showed that 2 night raids in December 1940 by a total of 296 bombers that dropped 262 tons of bombs on 2 Gelsenkirchen synthetic oil plants had done no obvious damage. By April 1941, the predicted average bombing error of 300 yards at night had been raised to 1,000 yards. And as a consequence, a major change in bombing policy was agreed. The air staff decided that for approximately 3/4 of each month, it is only possible to obtain satisfactory results by a blitz attack on large working-class and industrial areas in towns. The futility of attacking the specific targets laid down in the Western air plans was further demonstrated by an analysis of photographs taken by crews during June and July and circulated in August 1941.
28 raids were taken and the photographs therefore examined, and in August of that year, Mr. D.M. Butt, who was a member of the Cabinet Secretariat, produced a report based upon this. The rather depressing news emerged that of all those aircraft on those raids that reported attacking their targets, overall, including the occupied countries, only 1/3 of them got within 5 miles of their target. Over Germany, that figure was 1 in 4, and in the Ruhr, 1 in 10. Moreover, on poor nights, on moonless nights, in the Ruhr, that figure was 1 in 15, only got within 5 miles of their target.
Apart from navigational problems, RAF bombers began to suffer heavy losses, such as those during the night of the 7th to the 8th of November 1941, when 37 out of 400 were shot down. The winter months brought little improvement in the figures, and so, when Air Marshal Arthur Harris became Air Officer of RAF Bomber Command in February 1942, he faced immediate calls for resources to be diverted away from the unit. A veteran of Imperial policing and an admirer of Trenchard, Harris had previously been Air Officer commanding No. 5 Bomber Group and Deputy Chief of the Air Staff. In his new post, he vigorously supported a strong bombing campaign against Germany and resisted any attempts to reduce the resources at his disposal. Air Ministry orders to carry out area bombing, the euphemism for the bombing of built-up areas, predated his appointment, But professionally and personally, he fully supported the policy and pressed for more heavy bombers in order to carry it out. Harris was helped by the fact that the 4-engine bombers planned in 1936 were now at last in service.
In 1936, when war was inevitable, Bomber Command laid down specifications for heavier bombers, 4-engine bombers, which were not expected in service until 1941. The first to come into operation in February 1941 was the Sterling, with a bomb capacity of 14,000 pounds. It was followed very quickly the month later by the Halifax, which had a bomb capacity of 13,000 pounds. But it wasn't until a full year later, in March 1942, that the third of the Hemi bombers, and as it turned out the most successful, the Lancaster, came into operation and had the capacity to carry 22,000 pounds of bombs. Though these bombers therefore had vastly greater capacity than the twin-engine bombers that we got into the war with, in some cases 2 or 3 times the low capacity.
With these new heavy bombers, Harris set out to take the war into Germany's backyard. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, admitted enormous damage to the Baltic port of Lübeck on the 28th and the 29th of March 1942, where 200 acres were laid waste. 1,046 bombers struck Cologne in the celebrated 1,000-bomber raid on the 30th of May 1942.
We went to Cologne and back, and we were opposed by searchlights fired as an ACAC. The bomber was doing his best to get his bomb sight on the target, and you're doing your best to keep the airplane flying straight and level or whatever, and you eventually get to the target area and the pathfinders would be there dropping their flares, and you were told which flares to aim for, and then the bombs would go, and when you got rid of a load of bombs like 12,000 pounds, the airplane certainly knew about it. It would jump up like a bucking bronco, really.
Wenn ein Bombenteppich fiel und man hörte die Aufschläge, dann waren natürlich die Frauen diejenigen, die meistens dann aufgeschrien haben. Die Kinder haben dann ihre Mütter verängstigt gesehen, dann fingen sie auch an zu weinen, weil sie verblüfft waren oder entsetzt waren, weil ihre Mütter Angst hatten. Manchmal haben wir jede Nacht Angriffe gehabt, dann war auch mal eine Pause. Manchmal war nur eine Welle, die über uns wegfuhr und dann weiterflog. Und manchmal kamen in mehreren Wellen die Angriffe und man hörte dann immer, wie die Bomben, wie Bombenteppiche gelegt wurden. Das konnte man, die Aufschläge konnte man dann registrieren.
The study of raids on Essen in March and April showed that only 10% of the bombers got within 5 miles of their target. And despite the attempt to swamp the German defences by concentrating aircraft in a bomber stream, outside of the more spectacular successes, losses continued to rise. From August to October, Bomber Command suffered a 5.3% loss rate. During 1942, 1,235 bombers were lost and 2,839 damaged. The introduction of improved navigational aids raised hopes of lowering the loss rate and improving bombing accuracy and of making the campaign more effective.
The Butt report of August 1941 gave the RAF an enormous shock, and that gave the impetus to developing better navigational and bombing aids. The first of those to come into operation in March 1942 was something called G, which was a directional radio beam which enabled the navigator to pick up his position over the continent.
In my day, we had G, this marvellous navigation aid, radar navigation aid, but it quickly ran, the Germans jammed it. And I had a Canadian navigator, and when we got him in the middle, usually about the middle of the channel, he would say, "Lend me a flashlight, Ernie." And that, to me, that meant there was the end of that sort of navigation for the night, because it meant he was changing the channel. If he changed the channel, the next one wasn't going to be much good either. So then you're back to almost basics. And we seemed to get there somehow. I don't know how we did it. I think we did it by feel.
Despite the introduction of the new aids for bomber crews, precision bombing was still not possible. The accuracy of specialist operations, such as the spectacular Dam Busters raid by 617 Squadron against the Möhne and Eder dams of Western Germany, simply could not be achieved by main force squadrons.
On the night of the 16th, 17th of May 1943, 16 Lancasters of 617 Squadron attacked 6 German dams and destroyed 2 of them and damaged 1 of them. It was, in the words of Hans Rumpf, a German official, precision bombing of the highest order. It showed that precision targets could be hit at night in an area which was very difficult to locate. All of the dams are tucked away in valleys, in wooded areas, either in the Ruhr or the Fulda valleys. But of course, to do that, you had to form a special squadron, train them in a particular way, and have a special bomb. It was impossible to carry this out for main force operations, but it set a standard.
Area bombing of towns and cities remained the norm. Harris regarded the Dam Busters raid as one episode in the Battle of the Ruhr that lasted from March to July 1943, when 43 heavy raids were launched on Essen, Duisburg, Dortmund and Bochum. During July and August, 4 night raids on Hamburg caused, according to the German fire chief, gigantic damage, and to Harris, unimaginable destruction.
791 RAF bombers attacked Hamburg and wrought great destruction. The searchlights weren't able to pick them out. The guns weren't able to focus on them. The night fighters went around, as one of them said, chasing their own tails. The reason for that was that we dropped window. Window was a device of metallic strips which would interfere with the German radar transmissions, and therefore, in the words of Major General Kamhuber, who was responsible for the defences, made them blind.
Konnte man nicht aushalten. Und dann der Sottregen, also von dem fast alles verbrannt ist, flog ja alles durch die Gegend. Ne? Überall brannte das, wohin. Man wusste es nicht. Dann bin ich erst mal rum zu meinem Haus hin und da sah ich, wie die Flammen aus meiner Wohnung schossen und stand ich da mit meinem Sohn auf meinem Arm. Ich wollte zu meinen Eltern nach Rotenburgsort, das ist ein anderes Art Stadtteil von Hamburg, aber ich kam noch nicht durch, weil das überall brannte, die Straßen. Es war gefährlich, da durchzugehen, weil die Häuser zusammenbrachen. Verbrannt in einem Hochbunker, also Hochbunker, das ist ein Bunker von Karstadt gewesen. Da sind sie immer reingegangen. Meine Mutter fühlte sich da wohl, trotzdem ich mir gesagt habe, geh in den Hausbunker. Wollte sie nicht, dass sie mit meinem Vater da rein. Und da sind sie nicht mehr rausgekommen.
Raids such as Operation Gomorrah on Hamburg illustrated that area bombing was still the only real option for RAF Bomber Command. At the end of 1943, the Chief of the Air Staff, Sir Charles Portal, reflected that if it had been tactically possible to concentrate a quarter of our total bombs dropped on Germany on a distinct group of targets associated with oil, ball bearings or aero engines, the war would by now have been won. Bomber losses, however, were not substantially diminishing. In the period from November 1943 to March 1944, during 35 night raids, RAF Bomber Command lost 1,047 bombers. Each carried 7 men. A further 1,682 were damaged. On each of the 16 visits to Berlin, an average of 29 bombers were lost. On the 30th of March 1944, 795 bombers were dispatched to Nuremberg. 95 aircraft, carrying 655 men, were lost and 71 were damaged. These frightening figures were a brutal reminder that neither Germany or the Luftwaffe were yet beaten.
But you had to be on the alert from the time almost you left the English coast, because you see people shot down before they got to the Dutch coast. And then you get through that lot, and then of course you get the searchlights and the flak, and then the fighters were the main problem really. If you've got a fighter up your backside when you're on the bombing run, no way are you going to just fly straight level like that. And then you had everybody up there, and sometimes, like I mentioned Frankfurt, it was like Piccadilly Circus there. You see everything. You see Lancasters, you see Wellingtons, Yonkers 88s, ME-110s, and 109s. Everything was going hither and thither.
The United States Army Air Force went through similar experiences. It entered the Second World War wedded to the idea of precision bombing in daylight by self-defending bombers from a minimum 24,000 feet, encouraged by excellent results in practice, which led to claims that crews could place bombs in a pickle barrel.
In June 1942, the 8th Army Air Force began to congregate in England. When they arrived, they were equipped basically with 2 heavy bombers. There was the B-17E, which was the Flying Fortress, 13.50 machine guns with a range of 1,000 yards. The Flying Fortress had a bomb capacity of 5,000 pounds and a crew of 10. The other bomber was the B-24D, the Liberator. That also had a crew of 10. It only had 10 machine guns, but 4 of those were in power-operated turrets. They had a capacity of 8,000 pounds bomb load. Both of the aircraft theoretically had a top speed of 300 miles per hour, but in practice, in action, flew at about 180 miles per hour.
The first B-17s did not reach the 8th Army Air Force in England until July 1942, and only slowly did the numbers build up. By the close of 1942, 200 B-17s and 100 B-24s had crossed the Atlantic. Unlike RAF personnel, whose night operations meant evening briefings, the Americans rose in the chill of a misty dawn in preparation for a morning takeoff. The first 6 months of action found the US crews gaining experience all over the occupied countries of Western Europe. That changed in January 1943, the month in which an Anglo-American conference at Casablanca decided on the launching of a coordinated, combined bomber offensive. Lieutenant General Ira C. Eaker, its commanding general, resisted British attempts to switch the 8th Army Air Force to night bombing, and drew up the Eaker Plan for his bombers to attack 76 specific targets connected with certain industries vital to German armed forces support. At Casablanca, it was agreed that the Americans would bomb selected targets in Germany by day. However, during February 1943, they were able only to mount 2 operations, owing either to adverse weather conditions or lack of serviceable aircraft. Like the RAF before them, the Americans soon learned that the self-defending bomber was little more than a pipe dream. Operating from England, protective fighters had only enough fuel to reach the German border before they had to return to base. They would meet the bombers in the same area to guide them home, but by then, many had perished. On the 17th of April, 115 US aircraft attacked Bremen. 16 were shot down and 44 damaged. 22 out of 60 were lost against Kiel in June, and 6 missions flown in Blitz Week in July cost over 100 aircraft, lost or scrapped. By the close of July 1943, 8th Bomber Command had only 275 operational 4-engine bombers left. Colonel Curtis E. LeMay, commander of the 305th Bombardment Group, developed a complicated defensive formation in an effort to reduce losses.
Colonel Curtis LeMay came up with the idea of basing it upon the element of 3. Each squadron had 4 elements of 3, and each element would fly in an arrowhead, with the lead aircraft just behind it to the right 1, and just below that, on the left, another one. He built that up into a squadron, so you had the basic element, then the squadron formation. The 4 squadrons then formed into a group box, and that was known as a combat box of a bombardment group, all based upon the principle of an arrowhead with one high, one low, spread over 3,000 feet. The idea was that it will give mutual defence for all of those 3 bombardment groups in a big wing combat box.
Meanwhile, the Germans attacked his combat boxes with a bewildering range of tactics, boosted by the fact that their fighters could refuel quickly and return to the fray.
They had an airborne controller who stayed out of range and directed the attacks. Those attacks were basically carried out by the single-engine fighters, either in pairs, singly, or even in squadron formation, from the front and from the flanks. But occasionally they also came down from above, they dived out of the sun or the cloud, or came from underneath in what was called a javelin up attack. So it was an enormous battle. And to add to the fray, the Germans put either Junker 87 Stukas or Junker 88s above the bomber stream to drop down fragmentation bombs or parachute bombs on them. And to complete the attack, they had out of range in the rear twin-engine fighter bombers like the Messerschmitt 110 lobbing in rockets. So it was truly a great battle every time the Americans went to war in Germany.
In a combined mission against Regensburg and Schweinfurt on the 17th of August 1943, 60 bombers and 600 men went down. In all that week, 8th Bomber Command lost 148 aircraft. Of the Schweinfurt debacle, one gunner recalled, "We thought we were as hard as nails. After all, we were a combat crew. But right then we felt like 90-year-old men."
Die Flakabhör, die hörten wir ja immer, also vorher auch, als ich nicht im Keller war, ne, da hörte ich das ja und sah das ja auch. Ich habe mir das ja mal angeguckt, den Himmel. Es war wunderschön anzusehen, ne, die Leuchtspuren da von den Granaten oder was wir da abschossen. Also das war schon sehenswert, aber Angst hatte ich nachher dann doch, ne.
At night it was worse because it was spectacular at night. It looked pretty awful, looked pretty lethal. If you were at the front, which I often was, the gunners used to concentrate on the one at the front because I might hit somebody else. And the flak used to get very close, so you could see it out the corner of your eyes, and you could feel it banging underneath. You thought the bomb had gone, in fact. But it wasn't, unless it got very close, it wasn't going to shoot you down. That's the extraordinary thing.
In the wake of these disasters, the 8th Army Air Force could not mount a single mission, and the British renewed their pressure for a switch to night bombing. But the time needed to alter the whole system of training alone, which may have been as long as 2 years, meant that this option was ruled out. On the 6th of September, 45 B-17s were lost in a mission to Stuttgart. Between the 8th and 10th of October, a further 88 bombers went down. On the 14th of October, 291 bombers returned to Schweinfurt, where another 60 B-17s were lost. There was no other choice. Unescorted deep penetration missions into Germany were suspended. 1944 opened more brightly for the Allies as further improvements in navigational aids and the appearance of the Mustang fighter raised hopes.
The P-51B Mustang, which came into operation in December 1943, had 6.50 machine guns, could travel at 400 miles per hour, and therefore was in a position to cope with any of the German fighters then in existence. Moreover, it had a range of 700 miles, which could be doubled with drop tanks. Reputedly, in December 1943, when Goering saw a Mustang over Berlin, he said, "We have lost the war."
In February 1944, 8th Bomber Command flew 2,688 B-17 and 917 B-24 sorties into Germany, for the loss of 187 bombers, with another 24 subsequently written off. However, the most important statistic concerned the mission by 218 B-17s to Brunswick on the 29th of February. Protected by 554 P-47s, P-38s and Mustangs, only one bomber was lost. The Americans had proved that they could successfully fight their way to and from a primary target. In March 1944, the loss rate was 3.5%, a vast improvement on the 9.1% recorded in October 1943. To add to the increasing pressure on Germany, on the 20th of February, the 15th Army Air Force in Italy, under Lieutenant General Karl A. Spaatz, was ready to bomb targets in the south of the country. Spaatz had been appointed Commanding General of U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe in January 1944, and during the final weeks of the war, he would command U.S. Strategic Air Forces in the Pacific. During Big Week in February 1944, the 8th and 15th Army Air Forces together sent an average of 1,000 bombers each day against German targets. Spaatz and Harris were convinced that at last they were on the verge of achieving the destruction and dislocation of the German war industries sought by the Casablanca Directive of January 1943. D-Day planners now stepped in, demanding that the heavy bombers be allocated to their needs. And so from April to September 1944, the strategic bombing forces were placed under the control of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Although the attacks on German industrial targets were less frequent, they did not altogether cease. And Spaatz, in particular, remained convinced that an oil offensive was the key to victory. On the 12th of May, 935 8th Bomber Command aircraft were sent against 6 oil plants, at a cost of 46 bombers lost, rendering rather hollow the complaint of General Adolf Galland that lack of aviation fuel was restricting Luftwaffe activity. In June, 93 RAF bombers failed to return from the 832 sorties flown.
One of the most frightening experiences I had, in fact, was being combed in searchlights. Now that is frightening because you're sitting there, not all fat, dumb and happy, but you're sitting there and suddenly flash, there's light on like this, and then the others on it, and you're in a cone, just in a split second. And then you've got to get out of it if you can. And that's not easy because you can quite easily lose control of the aircraft or crash it. And that you feel very exposed, and you're like a bird in a cage, and you only concentrate on the instruments. Anyway, luckily I got out of it and lived to tell the tale. A lot of people didn't. You see, cones over Berlin would be huge. Not a hope in hell of getting out of it.
It was the establishment of Allied air bases on the continent, once the bridgehead in Normandy had been consolidated, that allowed bombers to operate with massive fighter support. The German defences suffered heavily, making life a little easier for both the day and night bombers. A British loss rate of 11% in June dropped to 3.7 in August. During July and August 1944, RAF Bomber Command dropped 120,000 tons of bombs on German targets, compared with 37,000 tons in the same months a year earlier. The 8th Bomber Command dropped 85,000 tons during the same period.
Das war nur einmal Bombenalarm und dann hörte man ja die Flugzeuge kommen, nicht? Aber war da auch nichts, keine Fallen oder wie? Da wurde uns nur gesagt, da brennt das, nicht? Die Straßen, das war ein Glühen, wo Kohlen früher gelagert wurden, nicht? Wo du kaufen konntest, Kohlen. Das war eine Glühmasse Da konntest du nicht vorbei. Die Straße, die Leute lagen auf der Straße tot. Wurden nicht wegtransportiert, weil das nicht konnten, die Feuerwehr, die konnten ja nicht löschen. Die konnten, wo sollten sie anfangen? Das war ein Chaos, war das.
There were still disagreements over bombing tactics. Spaatz continued to favor attacks on oil plants, and Harris area bombing of cities, while Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder, the Deputy Supreme Allied Commander, thought transportation targets more important. Inevitably, compromise was reached, even after the Strategic Air Forces reverted to national control in September. During the last 3 months of 1944, 53% of RAF Bomber Command's tonnage fell on cities, 15% on transportation, 14% on oil, and the rest in direct support of military and naval operations, such as the sinking of the battleship Tirpitz while at anchor in Norway on the 12th of November. Historians would later conclude that by late 1944, the Allies had achieved command of the air over Germany. At the time, the bomber crews might not have agreed. Despite their increasing successes, they continued to face the dangers posed by a determined German defense that was worryingly enhanced by the new threat of a German jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me-262, and the rocket-propelled Me-163 Comet.
The Me-262 had a speed of 540 miles per hour, which was considerably faster than even the Mustang, and they had two 30mm or two 50mm cannon, which if they got within range were extremely lethal. The 163, the rocket-propelled fighter, known as the powered egg because of its rather bulbous shape by the bomber crews, had two 30mm cannon, but was capable of 600 miles per hour, and more importantly could reach 30,000 feet in 2.5 minutes. But they suffered very much from mechanical failure, and they only had a very short endurance. They basically, because they were rocket-powered, could only essentially go up and down. So they made one quick pass, and then they had to go down again.
During the closing months of the war, the Americans did not exclusively attack precision targets, nor the RAF cities, and neither stuck solely to day and night bombing. On the 3rd of February 1945, for example, nearly 1,000 flying fortresses bombed Berlin. 3 days later, 8th Bomber Command attacked Magdeburg and Chemnitz. The overall losses might have been falling, but for individual crews, the raids remained a dangerous business. Those guys were like madmen with but one idea: to knock us down in a suicidal attack, wrote an American airman. That conclusion was not altogether fanciful. On the 4th of April 1945, flying an Me-262 which had run out of ammunition while defending a raid on Berlin, Major Heinrich Ehrler broadcast his intention of ramming an American bomber to ground control with the words, "We'll meet again in Valhalla." During the first quarter of 1945, the Ruhr area of Germany became virtually isolated through the destruction of its transport system. The Bielefeld Railway Viaduct was spectacularly smashed by a Grand Slam bomb devised by Barnes Wallis, the creator of the bouncing bomb, which breached the dams in 1943. Round-the-clock bombing, planned at Casablanca, had at last become a reality, with bombers flying across Germany by day and night, carrying bombs ranging from 10-ton high explosives to 4-pound incendiaries.
Es war ja so oft, dass ja nur gewisse Abschnitte in einer Stadt zerstört waren und andere Gebiete gar nichts von dem Angriff richtig gemerkt haben. Das waren immer so Mittelpunkte, und in dem Teil, wo dann gerade die Bomben gefallen war, war natürlich ein gewisser Horror und eine gewisse... Man hat erfahren, dass Tote waren, aber in den Zeitungen, so wie heute über Verkehrsunfälle oder so weiter Zahlen berichtet werden oder die Begleitumstände, das wurde in den Zeitungen gar nicht so erwähnt. Das war ja dann allmählich auch eine Tagesordnung.
From January to May 1945, the 8th Army Air Force alone dropped over 370,000 tons, and the RAF flew 67,483 sorties. By April 1945, Germany's main transport, oil and urban centres had all been severely damaged, and her ability to wage war at last fatally undermined. The cost of the air offensive had been high. RAF Bomber Command lost 55,573 aircrew during the Second World War, the great majority of whom died during operations over Germany. With casualties among escorting fighters, the US Army Air Force suffered 43,742 killed and 1,923 seriously wounded. But had it all been worthwhile? Was strategic bombing effective?
Post-war analysts, including some who helped to compile the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, claimed that only 10% of damage was done by the strategic bombing campaign to German war industry. This was vigorously challenged at the time, and of course there's some truth in that challenge, because the 10% was an overall figure. It didn't concentrate on, for example, the specific damage to the synthetic oil plants or steel production. Moreover, it didn't take into account what would have happened if no bombing had taken place. It was proved that the Germans had 1/5 slack in their industrial capacity at the beginning of the war. If that had been developed, that slack been taken up completely, they would have been able to develop many more war munitions than they did. So one has to take into account that it was 10% of damage of actual war production, and you have to take into account the fact that it didn't allow for the expansion that would have taken place if bombing hadn't occurred.
From 1943 onwards, the Allied air offensive had forced the Germans to withdraw aircraft, troops and equipment from other theatres of war to defend their homeland. The figures show this to be a fact. Between July and October 1943, the total Luftwaffe aircraft strength on the Western Front rose from 1,687 to 2,097, while its overall strength dropped from 5,396 to 4,830. Winston Churchill used the strategic bombing of Germany to persuade Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, that a second front had been opened in the West, and to help President Roosevelt resist calls for the European theater of war to be run down in favor of the Pacific. The strategic bombing campaign paved the way for Allied troops from East and West to converge on Berlin and ensure the overthrow of Hitler and his Nazi regime.
The people who criticise the bombing policy obviously haven't thought very much about it. We were fighting for our existence. We weren't fighting for anybody else when it came to the push. We were fighting for ourselves. And if we didn't win, we would have been enslaved by Germany, wouldn't we? That was it. We all realised this. And when you're fighting a war, you've got to win.